Howdy folks, Comic Cowboy here today with a brand spanking new video for you. And we're going to talk about just one book here before you. It's a mega key. It's Amazing Fantasy 15 from 1962. Here in lovely 3.5 unrestored condition. Held company by none other than, to my right and to your left, Batwoman in the DC Collectibles figure line. So, topic today is mega keys. And before we get into this discussion, I'm going to take you back into the Wayback Machine. We are going to go back briefly in time to the mid to late 1980s when I was first getting into comic books. Now at that time, I read them and I collected them, as did a lot of young people my age. And we bought these, not unlike folks still do today to some extent, in comic book stores, and those were magical places. And I think the difference between comic book stores that you have today and the stores that you had in the 1980s, which was a wonderful time to buy collectibles if you had any idea what you were doing, given the values today, were a bit different. So I went to a place in Santa Clara, California. Maybe some of you know the area. Maybe some of you even know this comic book store, which would be incredible. If you do, leave a comment. It was called Brian's Books. It's no longer there. And it was run by this guy, Brian. He ran the comic book store. As far as I know, he was the only employee there. Maybe he had someone else on staff. He always answered the phone. And to this day, given this is, good Lord, 25 years ago, whenever it was, and I can still hear him today, you'd call the shop, usually to check if he had a particular title that came in onto the newsstand, whether you're collecting Spider-Man or the X-Men or the Fantastic Four, whatever it was. And he would say, "Hello, Brian's Books." And it was just this amazing thing that just stays with you, honestly, for the rest of your life, because it's such a special place. Bought all my comics there. Why am I talking about this? So on the wall, which you still find today, for the most part, this is replicated at comic shows, at cons, right? There's the wall of books, right? You know, the display of books. Today, most of that material is slabbed, right? You know, in the holders. Now, in the 1980s, it was way before CGC holders and books being slabbed, right? These books were permanently on the wall in the comic shop. And this was the expensive stuff. So Brian's Books in Santa Clara, California had the newsstand, right, of all the new issues coming in, right? Who knows what they're selling for at that time? 35 cents an issue, whatever it was, 50 cents. And you buy them off the newsstand, you take them home, you put them in the Mylar and you know, the backing board. You'd read them and you put them back in the sleeve. Some folks obviously were still collecting at that time, principally. Then they had these sort of long boxes, right, where you would go through and look for back issues, and they were priced, you know, for the most part, according to, I believe, Overstreet at that time, the sort of tome that is still used in industry today. Although it doesn't really reflect current values, GP analysis really gives you more accurate data on that front. So anyway, you go into Brian's shop. There's Brian. You know, he kind of looked like Brian Wilson from the Beach Boys behind the counter. And behind him was the wall of comics, and that was the stuff, as a young person, you could never afford. That's where the keys were. All raw, right? Of course. You know, there was X-Men 1, Fantastic Four 1. These are the books from the early 1960s. I don't think he ever had an Action Comics 1 in the shop. It's possible, but I don't recall that. He definitely had the X-Men 1. All these Silver Age keys. I'm sure there was an Amazing Fantasy 15. And these books at that time, you know, were selling for the most part, in the hundreds of dollars. And as a young person, I could not afford those books. It would be years before I would be able to acquire that kind of material for the most part, as an adult, right? And I'm making a point about where this is all going, right? I sometimes could afford the back issues that Brian had for Amazing Spider-Man or Fantastic Four or X-Men, some of the later issues, some of the non-keys, but even for the most part, growing up modestly as I did in San Jose, California, I couldn't afford that material, right? You know, we're talking the mid 1980s, right? I didn't have the money. I would have to mow lawns. I would have to irrigate lawns just to get enough money to go to the arcade. So I'd have, you know, enough quarters to play high-speed pinball or some of the other games that were in the arcade at that time, all coin-op stuff, right? The golden age. I couldn't afford the books in the long boxes. I could afford some of the stuff that was new to the stand, the new issue stuff. And behind the wall, behind Brian, I should say, were all these seminal keys priced in the hundreds of dollars, and I couldn't afford them, right? Keys will always go up in value. I realize that is potentially a controversial statement to make and one subject to discussion. But I am talking about the mega keys. This book in particular is very special, not only because it's the first appearance of Spider-Man. Of all the, and this is routinely, every year they survey, you know, the top 100 books of the Golden Age, top 100 books of Silver and Overstreet. This will always sit on top of the most significant books of the Silver Age. That should never change. You know, it just holds a special place in the hearts for all collectors, even though one could argue that Showcase 4 first Silver Age appearance of The Flash, Barry Allen, is potentially more of a significant book in terms of history because it ushered in the Silver Age of comic book superheroes. Nevertheless, this is the book. This is essentially the definition of a mega key. This book, despite it going a little bit like this, right, will always go up in value over time. There are always going to be collectors. There are thousands of them today that can't afford this book, but one day they will potentially have enough money to do so. They're probably younger or financially it doesn't make sense. Whatever the reason may be, there is always an audience for this particular book. And if you look at the price charting of Amazing Fantasy 15 over the last 8-10 years, it reflects that. It simply has gone up over the years quite dramatically, despite the fact that it's got some moments in time where it goes down slightly, 5%, 10%, typically recovers. With mega keys, my advice is if you can afford them, whether that's Jim 83 or you know, Amazing Spider-Man #1, X-Men 1, Fantastic Four 1. The list goes on and on. These books, I believe, should be held for the long term. If you can, hold on. If you've got these mega keys, hold on to them 5-10 years. That's the horizon of this kind of investment over time. Now, I also encourage you to enjoy the bounty and the scope of all of collecting, right? I did not set my target to be put all my collecting into one bucket, which is the mega key. I built for years to get this kind of a book. So, you know, I've got hundreds and hundreds of comic books, some, you know, very inexpensive, some moderately priced, some relatively expensive. None of my books in this sort of area code of price, right? And the point I'm trying to make with taking you into the Wayback Machine, maybe you remember when you were much younger, think about it, if you collected and enjoyed comic books or baseball cards from the 1980s, the most expensive material at that time in terms of the gap in your means to acquire that kind of material today has persisted for other collectors, for other younger people that don't have the means to acquire this material. Doesn't mean that the intention is not there over time. And also, when you have a mega key and something priced this expensively, it tends to be a little bit of an easier asset to track, because all Amazing Fantasy 15s, for the most part, clearly not every copy, is slabbed, whether that's CGC or CBCS. They're in the census report. You know how many there are in each grade. And there's enough of this material out there. It's not like a Golden Age book where supply is quite a bit less than this type of material. Harder to track the prices when there's less sales. There's a lot of consistent sales data found with these mega keys for you really to kind of have a sense of what your book is worth at almost any moment in time. I'll say a few things about this particular book before I close the video, right? You will hear often folks talking about Marvel chipping, right? So when I was looking for a lower grade copy, something I'd say in the 1.8 to 3.5 range. When you start getting to this book in 4.0, 5.0 and higher, it gets really expensive. That does not mean that books, AF-15s in higher grades do not have issues of Marvel chipping. They may. The Marvel chipping typically is on the edge, not on the spine. This is where the printers cut the paper, right? In the early 1960s. There was essentially a paper guillotine, for lack of a better word, cutting the material at the printers. And when it cut along the line here, what it did, it created this disturbance in the paper because for whatever reason, maybe it was the month or the year in the early 1960s, with our friends at Marvel Comics, the quality of paper was not that great. They remedied that issue. But books in the early 1960s, including Hulk 1, which has a black cover, there certainly is a noticeable Marvel chipping issue with some of the copies, and it just looks like it's serrated along the edges. It's literally chipping. There's pieces out of the edge because it essentially cracked a little bit when the device came and cut the cheap paper. So if you can find a copy, as I did here, which took me some time to do, I bought this privately. I found a copy in 3.5 blue label with no Marvel chipping, and I just think it looks really sharp. I don't know if you can see the book here with all the glare. It's a little hard to do. Here we are shooting this video in the middle of the afternoon in San Francisco, California, and the light's bouncing off Spidey. The other thing I look for with these lower grade AF-15s, I don't want any writing on the cover, meaning someone took a marker and they wrote on the cover. You see that often with the lower grade copies. You will often see tape on cover, and it's noted here under the label if there's some issue like that, or a small amount of glue on the cover. You still get blue, meaning unrestored book, but oftentimes you'll find tape along the spine. I don't like tape on the spine. Now when you start going through this checklist of all these things you want in an AF-15, that's really hard to find in lower grade. I managed to find this particular copy, And lastly, it's got off-white to white pages, which is really nice quality here. And the back of the book looks quite fine as well. I don't think that this book could ever be pressed into a 4.0 because it's got this color breaking creases across the book, right? So you press it, usually it remedies surface defects that do not affect the color, right? The creases here are breaking the color. Great book in hand. I mean, when this thing came, I mean, you have to imagine, like in the middle of this COVID situation, you know, the folks from the postal office or FedEx, they ring your buzzer and you buzz them in and they drop it off in the hallway. So I didn't know if this was like a box of cornflakes or an AF-15. It was just sitting there in the foyer of this facility that I'm at. So I'm happy to share a little bit of history with you. And you know what? Reflect on what your own experience has been as a collector, right? Where are the historical breadcrumbs from you? It's a really interesting discussion. You know, when did you first get into collecting comics? I think for people that collect books, it's not always the case with every single collector. You probably read this material or you collected it when you were younger. There's a reason I buy this stuff and I don't buy PSA graded sports cards, although I collected that stuff in the 1980s. And on that point, I'll share one other thing, and this is a true story. I have not looked at the actual data, but you just have to believe me that this is the case. This is probably early to mid 1980s when I was collecting the comic books, and I was also collecting sports cards. We opened the packs, and this is probably when I was really into the baseball card collecting. The stuff, honestly, today, it's really almost not worth the paper it's printed on unless it's like a PSA 9 or 10 or a Gem Mint PSA 10s, almost impossible to get with this stuff. That aside, I was buying the wrong sports cards in the 1980s, so was like almost everyone. If we were smart as young kids, we wouldn't have bought the Fleer Donruss sports cards from the 1980s. We would have bought the Fleer basketball cards and gone after the Jordan rookie, right? Stuff like that, or football cards. So, you know, when I was collecting, I don't know about you, in the 80s, if that is actually your demographic, maybe you're older, maybe you're younger, I don't know, all welcome here. No one was collecting the football and the basketball stuff or the hockey stuff. You looked at, people dabbled in it, but not quite to the extent of baseball. Nevertheless, there were a lot of card shows at that time. Also, just a wonderful experience, an incredible memory, where you would go to these convention centers. I grew up in the South Bay of California. They were in Santa Clara County or San Mateo County, and you would go to this great auditorium, and there'd be all these dealers with all their wares in front of them. And of course, all this is before slabbing of cards and slabbing of the comic books, third-party graded stuff. It's just all in the case. There was, at one of these shows, the famous Honus Wagner T206 card. You may have heard of this card. It was the authentic thing at this show. Long story short, today that card probably sells nowhere south of $1 million. Like, nowhere south of $1 million. It's if you can find an authentic card, right? You know, it's incredible what the T206 Honus Wagner sells for today. Millions of dollars. It was selling in poor condition at a card show. I remember this. Now, I don't remember the exact price, but it was around $3,500, $3,500. And we collected baseball cards. No doubt, me and all my buddies were really into it. We mostly could afford the packs. And sometimes when we would go to the card shops, we'd buy some of the older material. So we're collecting in 82, 83. So that means we weren't collecting in 1980 when you had the rookie card of Ricky Henderson, or we weren't really collecting in 81, 82, and you had like kind of Cal Ripken rookie cards, things like that. So we'd go back and we'd buy those. We couldn't afford the stuff, we called them olds, the material from the 50s and 60s, the Aarons, the Mantles, all those, the Willie Mays, those types of figures. But we remember seeing the Honus Wagner at the show for around $3,500, right? And we sort of marveled at it. It was in the case. This is just way before people were trying to counterfeit this stuff. Not like it is today, where you have to watch a show for 40 minutes on the Discovery Channel, where people are putting the T206 under lasers to determine if it actually is authentic, because it's so valuable. It was in the case, and I remember at that time, like $3,500 may as well have been $1 million to me and my buddies. We could not pool all our money together, all 12 of us that collected, to buy that baseball card. And if I went to my parents at that time and said, hey, I want to get about $3,000 to buy this baseball card, they would have thought I was off my rocker, and they may not have had the $3 grand handy. They certainly wouldn't have bought it. That's what that card was selling for in the 1980s, in some cases, if you could find it. It's incredible. Even this stuff in the 1980s, AF-15, I don't know what it was selling for, probably in the hundreds of dollars. I'm not suggesting that in 10, 15 years from now, that this amazing fantasy will be selling for, $75,000, $100,000. It's not outside the realm of possibility that something like that could happen. You have to figure there's also inflation with this stuff. A dollar this year is quite a bit different. The purchasing power of a dollar is quite a bit less than 10 years ago, 20 years ago. All right, that about wraps it up. Do subscribe if you haven't done so already, and share your comments. What are your favorite mega keys? Share about, if you could, because I'm real curious, some childhood stories about collecting. That's always fun. And, if you collected sports cards too, or still do, curious to know how that's going for you. Take it easy. Thanks for watching.